Okay, we're starting on a new unit today, and in 3-1 our topic is going to be transversals. And so let's start by defining that word transversal. So a transversal is a line, and what it does is it cuts at least two other lines. And so notice this line is being identified as the transversal because it cuts these two lines. Alright, so we've got another transversal here. Line L is cutting lines T and M. And so when that happens, you've got 8 different angles that are formed, and they're labeled here 1 through 8. Okay, so we have some more vocabulary words that we need to define. And the first one is consecutive. Consecutive, we're talking about same side of the transversal. Same side of the transversal. Alright, so angles on the same side of the transversal are considered consecutive angles. So like for example, since my transversal here is L, angles 1, 3, 5, and 7 would be considered consecutive angles because they are on the left hand side of the transversal, and angles 2, 4, 6, and 8 would be considered consecutive angles because they're on the right hand side of the transversal. Okay? Now, some resources refer to consecutive angles as same side angles. So you will hear those two words used interchangeably. Same side means consecutive. Now, alternate means opposite sides of the transversal. Okay, opposite sides of the transversal. So, like for example, 1 is on the left-hand side of the transversal, and 8 is on the right-hand side of the transversal. So they would be considered opposite. So those are alternate angles. Now, interior refers to inside the cut lines. And exterior refers to outside the cut lines. Alright. And so when we say inside the cut lines, you could think about these cut lines as a fence or a pipe. Okay? So 3, 4, 5, and 6, they're inside the interior. Inside of the cut lines, or inside the pipe, you could think. Okay? 1, 2, 7, and 8, they would be exterior. They're outside of the cut lines, or outside of the pipe that's formed by T and M. Okay? And the last word, corresponding, those refer to angles that are in the same position. Alright, that are in the same position. Alright? And so, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to identify some angle pairs. And so the first angle pair that we want to be able to identify is consecutive interior angles. Consecutive interior angles. Alright? And so, consecutive means on the same side of the transversal, and interior means inside the cut line. So I need to be on the same side of the transversal, and I need to be inside of the cut lines. So, like for example, we could say that angle 3 and angle 5 would be considered consecutive. They're on the same side. They're both on the left-hand side of the transversal. and they're interior, they're inside of the two cut lines. So a pair of consecutive interior angles would be like angle 3 and angle 5. Okay, and that's not the only pair of consecutive interior angles in this particular drawing. We could have, for example, you could have also angle 4 and angle 6 as consecutive interior angles. All right. Okay. All right. The next angle pair we want to try to identify is going to be consecutive exterior angles. So now they're on the same side, but they're outside of the cut lines. So the same side of the transversal, but outside of the cut lines. So like, for example, angle 1 and angle 7. And another pair of consecutive exterior angles would be 2 and 8. Alternate interior, so they're on opposite sides of the transversal but inside of the cut lines. Like, for example, angle 3 and angle 6. They're on opposite sides of the transversal but they're inside of the cut lines. Another pair of alternate interior angles would be 4 and 5. Alternate exterior, okay, on opposite sides of the transversal but outside of the cut lines. Like, for example, angle 1 and angle 8. They are on opposite sides, alternate, and they're outside of the cut lines. So exterior, alternate exterior. Another pair of alternate exterior, by the way, would be angle 7 and angle 2. All right. Now, up until this point, we have covered pairs of angles that come from the different intersections. All right. And so to be consecutive or alternate anything, they've got to come from opposite intersections. The same thing is true for corresponding angles. They've got to be in the same position. So, like, for example, angle 1 and angle 5. All right, angle 1 and angle 5 are considered corresponding angles because they're in the same position with respect to both intersections. So, like, for example, angle 1 is up and to the left. Angle 5 is also up and to the left. If I were to take this line T and slide it down to where it intersects at the same point, then angle 1 and angle 5 would kind of drop right on top of each other. They're corresponding, they're in the same position. Then, of course, 2 corresponds with 6, 4 corresponds with 8, 3 corresponds with 7. So those would all be examples of pairs of consecutive, of corresponding angles, right? All right, so let's see here. What else do we have? The next type of angle that we want to identify is an angle type that we have already talked about in Unit 1, and that's vertical angles. And so remember, vertical angles are angles that are on opposite sides in the same intersection. So a pair of vertical angles here would be like 1 and 4. So angle 1 and angle 4 would be considered vertical angles. Right? And likewise, you could have 2 and 3, 5 and 8, or even 6 and 7 would be considered vertical angles. Also, in Unit 1, we talked about how to identify a linear pair. All right, so remember, a linear pair, they've got to be adjacent, and then they must add up to 180. So, like, for example, angle 5 and angle 6. They form a linear pair, they're adjacent, and together they make half a circle. They add up to 180. So there are several examples of angles that would be considered a linear pair. 2 and 4, 4 and 3, 3 and 1, 1 and 2, 6 and 8, 8 and 7, 7 and 5, and so forth. Okay. Now, here's the important thing to distinguish. Okay, the first 5 angles that we've looked at, angle pairs, right, all the consecutives, the alternates, and the corresponding, all 5 of those, they are not adjacent to each other. meaning they are in different intersections. Okay, they are not in the same intersection. Okay, one would come from the top and one would come from the bottom. However, these other two, they are adjacent to each other. Okay, so that means that they are in the same intersection. All right, so vertical angles are in the same intersection, and then linear pair would be in the same intersection. Okay, so that's one thing that we got to make sure that we keep in mind as we move forward and start doing the problems that we're going to be asked to identify. All right, and so let's take a look at a diagram here. And so on this diagram we have 4 different lines that are intersecting to form 16 different angles. And so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to identify the angle pair. So the first angle pair I want to identify is angle 4 and angle 5. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is locate those 2 angles. So here's 4 and here's 5. Okay, now the next thing I need to do is identify which transversal makes those 2 angles. And so out of the 4 lines that are here, the transversal that creates angle 4 and angle 5 would be line M. Line M is the transversal here. Okay, now it's important to identify the transversal because your alternate and your consecutive and your interior and your exterior are going to be based on which line is the transversal and which lines are the cut lines. Okay, so we have to identify the transversal, and that will help us then to identify the angle pair correctly. So 4 and 5, let's take a look. All right, so when I'm looking at these, I can see very quickly they're on opposite sides of the transversal. That would be alternate, so it's going to be alternate something. We know that. Okay, now are they interior angles or exterior angles? Are they inside the cut lines or are they outside the cut lines? Well, in this case, 5 and 4 are inside the cut line, so that makes them alternate interior angles. Alternate interior angles. Okay, let's try the next one. 8 and 15. 8 and 15. So here's 8, here's 15. Okay, the first thing I need to do is identify which line is the transversal. Well, the transversal that creates those 2 would be line Q. Q is the transversal. All right, now, next thing that we want to make sure we can recognize here is the transversal is now kind of oriented different from the way that we have viewed it so far in all the examples that we've looked at. It's kind of going sideways instead of up and down. All right, same principles, those still apply. So here's 8, here's 15. Are they on the same side or opposite sides of the transversal? Well, they're on the same side. They're both on the bottom. Because remember, Q is your transversal. So I don't have a left and a right side of my transversal. I have a top and the bottom of the transversal. They're both on the bottom. Okay. Let's see. So now I know that they are going to be on the same side, so they're consecutive something, right? Now, the next thing, are they inside or outside of the cut lines? Okay. So here's the interior, inside. Here's the exterior, outside. So they're inside. This is consecutive interior. All right, now when we say interior and exterior in a drawing like this, please make sure that you're aware we're not talking about the interior and the exterior of the quadrilateral here. That's not what we're talking about. So we're not talking about inside and outside of the four-sided figure. All right? Okay, so we're talking about inside and outside of the cut lines. One strategy that you can use to help you with this that we kind of saw last time as well is that you can just completely ignore line P because it's not involved in the creation of any of the angles, either of the 2 angles that they had asked me about, right? And so if you want to just cover up line P, then you can do that. And then now you can kind of see, okay, this is the interior and out here is the exterior, all right? So if that line's throwing you off, just cover it up. Don't even look at it. You can ignore that particular line, whichever one's not involved in the angles. Okay, so 10 and 11, let's take a look at that. So 10 and 11, the first thing that I should notice immediately is that these 2 are in the same intersection. All right, so these 2 are in the same intersection, right? And so what that means is it can really only be two answers. So if they're in the same intersection like this, then you've either got linear pair or they're vertical. And in this case, the two angles here are vertical angles, so I'll identify them as vertical. 1 and 3. 1 and 3 here. All right, so once again, they're in the same intersection, so there's not really a transversal to look at here. 1 and 3 form a linear pair. All right, so if you look at the two angles and they're in the same intersection, then that's a pretty good hint right there that it's either going to be linear pair or vertical, one of those two answers. 2 and 10, let's check that one. Here's 2, here's 10. Okay, so again, my transversal here is P, meaning I'm going to ignore line Q completely. I'm going to pretend it's not even there when I'm answering this question. Now, here's the next thing I want to look at. Okay, really, one piece of advice that I would give you is you probably want to check corresponding first before you do your alternate and your consecutive. Here's why. Because in this particular one, 2 and 10, they're both up and they're to the right. So that means that they are corresponding. Now, the reason why you want to check that first is because that will save you from this headache. All right, so they're on the same side of the transversal, so that means consecutive. But wait, 2 is in the interior, but 10's on the exterior, so is it interior or exterior? Well, the reason why it's like that is because it's neither one. All right, they're corresponding. Okay, so might want to get in the habit of checking corresponding first before you check anything else. All right, what else we got? So we've got 9 and 15 now to look at, so let's identify where they are. Here's 9, here is 15. Okay, so in this case, my transversal is line L, and they're on the same side, right? Are they corresponding, though? So 9 corresponds with 13, so they're not corresponding. And so they are on the same side of the transversal, but they're outside the cut lines, and then that would make them consecutive exterior angles. And the last one, 1 and 12, is what we're looking at here. So here's 1, here's 12. The line to create those would be line P. Line P is my transversal. So again, if this is my transversal, now we're ignoring line Q. It's not even here. And so they are not corresponding because 1 corresponds with 9 and 12 corresponds with 4. So now I'm going to go to alternate or consecutive. So they're on opposite sides of the transversal, so I know that's alternate something, right? And they're outside of the cut line, so that's going to make alternate exterior as your correct answer. All right? And so now we're going to use all of those concepts that we have taken a look at here now and let you go in and complete the quiz.